Yeah.
Okay, well, as long as we're talking about taxes and finances and budget, I'd like to get in a little bit to the LGA,
Yeah.
which could you just, for our listeners, explain just in a nutshell what LGA is?
Well, local government aid was created about 40 years ago, I think.
Okay.
1971, I think, was the year. And basically, it's to the conception of local government aid was to make sure that cities that did not have, or townships, and the state's changed so much since 1971, but that they all had basic city services, whether that was water and sewer, police and fire, the absolute basics that they would get help with at a state level. So the wealthier cities ended up pooling some of that money, and it was spit out to cities that supposedly didn't have a tax base to help them with their city essentials. Now, it's
it's sort of a tax the rich to subsidize the less fortunate.
Yeah, that's, again, the conception behind it. I think it's flawed thinking. I think it shows how when the government tries to satisfy everyone, what they do is satisfy no one. Because LGA is a system that no one's happy with right now.
Right.
Because the cities who were getting it are having it slashed. The cities who've been paying it for 30 or 40 years are going, why the heck are we still paying it? I see all the money going to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I'm wondering how those cities, how anyone can make the case that Minneapolis, with corporate headquarters, sports stadiums, all that stuff doesn't have a tax base. I don't know how the case can be made. And the only thing I can think of is either A, they've cut political deals to where, okay, I'll support your bridge in Worthington if you support my dog park in Minneapolis, something like that. Or they're not spending the money on what it was supposed to be spent for, or they're just simply spending too much, generally speaking. But I'm not a big fan of LGA. I'm not a big fan of the concept. The formula really needs to be changed and looked at. And I really hope that the legislature and the governor take a look at that instead of just throwing money at it or cutting it, that we change the system as it's been.
Well, LGA is one of those things that's actually controlled by the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other things that the legislature does that affect the city of Crystal?
Well, I think there's a lot the legislature can do to change government, generally speaking, and help out the cities. One of the things we really need is pension reform. That's a big, big thing. And I'm not exactly sure, like the PARA, the public employee retirement, that cost has gone up, I believe, over 30% for the city of Crystal in the last 4 years. Our contributions to the employees. Now, I don't know if we have to, if we are forced to be a part of that, but I think pension reform is something that if we don't have to be, we ought to be taking that up as a city. I mean, there's a reason that the private sector has gone out of pensions, because they're unsustainable, and private companies don't have this endless pot of money called the taxpayers. But the state, and they've taken some baby steps in that direction. They've had some minor reforms. But one thing they ought to do is, if we're forced to put money in those pensions, they ought to give an opt-out to cities. And you come up with your own plan, a 401k type thing. Now, it'd be called a 403b plan in the public. Or give incentives for cities to do that, because they haven't done anything to change the structural problems involved in a pension. I think another thing that they could do is, if they're going to abolish levy limits, if that's something, if we want to return to more local control, then we as the citizens ought to set a limit on what the government, have a referendum on what the city, like we do with the school districts. Mm-hmm. Let's pass a 6-year, 7-year referendum and set a max levy that the city can spend. Now that would be real local control, because when the city council talks about local control, they mean they get to control your money. When I talk about local control, I want you to set the levy limit. Let the pinheads in St. Paul get rid of the levy limits at the same time, and make the city explain to the citizens why we need something, What are the consequences if we don't get something? And I think that'd be a compromise in a way to get St. Paul off of our back. I think another thing that they could do is eliminate things like the Met Council, things like the Three Rivers Park District, these unconstitutional forms of government that are coming in and trying to strong-arm plans on the cities and trying to push their agenda on the cities, and have the legislature take back the appropriations process and not farm it out to third parties. And I think those are a whole host of things that not only would bring local control back, but they would also be, in the long run, financially beneficial, because we as a city would not be subject to the Met Council's fines and their insisting we do things their way and them holding back money if we don't want to. At the same time, I think with a referendum, the citizens would have the control over their city government that they really don't have right now. They were really subject. We have no recourse until the next election as to what they do for the budget process.